You have to sit with this for a second. You genuinely have to sit with it, because what Kendrick Lamar did to Drake's fan base is no longer a rap conversation. It stopped being a rap conversation a long time ago. What is unfolding right now, in the summer of 2026, more than 2 years after the last diss record landed, is a fully documented psychological event that historians of this culture are going to be pulling apart for the next 20 years. And I am telling you on this channel, on this microphone, in this exact moment, this needs to be studied. Not talked about. Not reacted to. Studied. Because the man who dropped Not Like Us in 2024 has somehow, in 2026, produced a fan base on the other side that is still crashing out in real time in public places over songs that came out when Joe Biden was still the sitting president of the United States. Think about that. Actually stop scrolling and think about that. There are grown men in Toronto right this second who are throwing speakers, filming apology videos, launching GoFundMe campaigns to replace equipment they broke because somebody near them played the wrong song. That is not fandom. That is not loyalty. That is a documented behavioral pattern that has metastasized into something the culture has never witnessed before. Leave a like right now if you have watched this happen with your own 2 eyes, hit subscribe, and drop a comment before we get any deeper because I am about to walk you through why the exact structure of what Kendrick built, the songs, the timing, the industry positioning, and the one line I am promising we will get to before this video ends, is the precise reason we are still watching this collapse play out 2 years after the fact. Everybody keeps asking who won the battle. That is the wrong question. The right question, and the only question that matters at this point, is why the losing side is still losing today, harder than they were losing on the day the final song dropped, and what that reveals about the machinery underneath all of this that nobody wants to say out loud. Let me set the table properly, because if you are new here, or if you have been living under a rock for the last 2 years, you need the full picture before we go any deeper. In the spring of 2024, Kendrick Lamar and Drake, Aubrey Drake Graham for the record, the biggest commercial rapper of the last decade and a half, engaged in the most publicly consumed rap battle in the history of the genre. Not one of the biggest. The biggest. Streams-wise, footprint-wise, culturally-wise. Not Like Us alone became the most streamed diss track in history, went on to sweep multiple Grammys, including Record of the Year and Song of the Year at the 67th Grammy Awards, and became the centerpiece of the Super Bowl 59 halftime performance in February 2025, which itself became the most watched halftime show of all time. That is the surface of what happened. Kendrick did not simply win the battle. Kendrick converted the battle into a permanent piece of infrastructure inside American pop culture. Meanwhile, Drake spent the back half of 2024 and most of 2025 tangled in a series of legal maneuvers against Universal Music Group over the promotion of Not Like Us, a defamation suit that was dismissed by Judge Jeanette Vargas on October 9, 2025, and which is now sitting in appeals as we speak here in the summer of 2026. That is the timeline. That is the receipt. That is what everybody agrees actually happened. But here is where the story stops being simple. Because what has continued to happen, long after the song stopped dropping, long after Kendrick moved on to GNX, long after Drake moved on to whatever era he is currently branding, is that Drake's fan base did not move with him. Drake's fan base got stuck. Drake's fan base has calcified in the emotional moment of May 2024. And the stakes of that are not just personal, and they are not just cultural. They are systemic. Personally, this means Drake is entering the second half of the decade carrying a stan army that is actively damaging his brand every time they open their mouths in public. Culturally, this means an entire wing of hip-hop's mainstream audience is now defined not by their love for the music, but by their inability to accept a verdict the rest of the culture rendered 2 years ago. And systemically, this means the streaming and social apparatus Drake's entire career was built on has been exposed as a mirror that only reflects what the fan base wants to see, no matter what the actual world outside is showing them. That is a much larger problem than a rap beef. That is a problem about how the entire ecosystem of loyalty and identity in modern hip-hop actually functions. And we need to set the record straight on what is genuinely going on inside that ecosystem right now, because the surface story you have been fed is missing the layer underneath it, and once you see the layer underneath, you cannot unsee it. Let me begin with what everybody can see with their own two eyes, because before we get to the deeper stuff, you need to be reminded of just how unhinged the surface has gotten. The most obvious piece of visible evidence is the Toronto speaker incident, which if you have been anywhere near hip-hop TikTok or hip-hop YouTube over the last few months, you already know about. A Drake fan in Toronto, Drake's own city, the city Drake calls the Six, the city Drake has constructed an entire identity around defending, physically attacked another person's Bluetooth speaker because that person was playing a Kendrick record in public. Just playing it. Not directing it at him. Not shouting it in his face. Just playing music. And this grown adult, in a place with witnesses and cameras and consequences, decided the appropriate response was to grab the speaker and hurl it. And then, because this is 2026 and the front-facing camera is genuinely the worst invention in modern human history, he returned and filmed an apology video that was not actually an apology video, in which he explained he did it because he did not want Canadians to look, and I quote loosely, like clowns in front of the Americans. He then launched a GoFundMe to replace the property he damaged. So the fans have to fund his emotional breakdown. Read that back to yourself slowly and ask whether that is a healthy fandom or a documented cry for help. The second piece of surface evidence is the Rogers Centre shows. Kendrick and SZA rolled through Toronto in the summer of 2025 on the Grand National Tour, played 2 sold-out nights at the Rogers Centre in the middle of Drake's own city, and received a standing ovation in the middle of Not Like Us. A standing ovation in Toronto for the song about Drake. And Drake, per widely reported coverage at the time, did not attend, did not respond, and instead spent that stretch running a live stream with Kai Cenat. That is not a small detail. That is the visible, verifiable, on-camera moment where you watch the emotional geography of the culture redraw itself in real time in front of an entire stadium. The third piece of surface evidence is the streaming data, and this is the terrain where people love to twist the story. Yes, Drake still puts up massive streaming numbers on a daily basis. That has never been in dispute. Nobody serious has ever argued Drake stopped being a commercial force. But when you look at the composition of what those numbers actually represent, and you compare them to how Kendrick's catalog has been consumed since the beef, the picture is not the picture the Stan Army wants it to be. Kendrick's post-beef streams are being consumed as event albums, as cultural monuments, as records people are deliberately going out of their way to sit down and study. Drake's streams are being consumed as background music. Those two consumption patterns are not equivalent. Those numbers do not carry the same cultural weight. Anybody who has been in this game for more than 5 minutes knows the difference between a stream that means something and a stream that just happens because the algorithm did what the algorithm does. And the fourth piece of surface evidence, and this one hurts, I am not going to soften it for you, this one is genuinely uncomfortable if you are being honest about it, is the state of Drake's own public communications. This is a man who used to control every narrative he was in. This is a man who used to time his own posts, his own leaks, his own features, his own alliances with the precision of a chess grandmaster. And now, in 2026, Drake is watching his fan base speak for him in public in ways he cannot correct, cannot moderate, and cannot walk back. And the version of Drake the world is seeing is being drawn by people who cannot even hold a Bluetooth speaker without launching it. Does everybody understand how catastrophic that is for a brand? Does everybody understand what it means when the loudest voices representing you in the wild are the exact voices making your case impossible to defend? And oh, do I have more for you? Because if you thought the visible chaos was bad, we are only getting started. This next section is the one the loyalists are truly not going to like. I need you locked in here, because what I am about to walk you through is not surface-level noise. This is the layer where the people who actually know the artists are talking and where the culture around Drake begins showing cracks even the fan base cannot spin. Stay with me, because when we reach the section on what the industry itself has been saying, and I am promising you we are getting there before this video ends, you're going to understand why this whole thing was engineered to land exactly where it landed. Do not save your comments for the end. Drop one right now. Tell me who you think this fan base is actually loyal to, because the deeper we dig, the less the answer looks like the man on the album covers. Layer 2, the cultural layer, is where this entire thing goes from embarrassing to genuinely revealing, because you have to remember, when a rap beef ends, the artists themselves usually move on faster than anybody. What sticks around is the ecosystem of people orbiting those artists, the associates, the affiliates, the podcasters, the fellow rappers, the people who share management, share studios, share history. And in that orbit, over the last 2 years, the pattern has been unmistakable. The first piece of cultural evidence is the pattern of silence from artists who used to be Drake adjacent. Look at how many rappers who used to be quick to jump on a Drake feature, quick to co-sign, quick to appear in the background of a Drake music video, have quietly stopped showing up. That silence is not neutral. That silence is a data point. In this industry, when the phone stops ringing and the cosigns stop landing, that is the culture telling you something it will never put in a press release. The second piece of cultural evidence is what happened inside Drake's own city during the Rogers Center shows. Reports out of Toronto during that stretch documented that Kendrick's team had noticeable security escalation on the ground, and that certain Toronto-affiliated figures, including Top 5, a Toronto rapper widely understood as a Drake associate, posted videos that read as direct threats and, per widely circulated reports, was allegedly seen searching for Kendrick outside his hotel in downtown Toronto. That is not a fan being angry on Twitter. That is a member of the Drake orbit escalating a situation that had already ended musically, in a way that only made the visible optics worse. And then there is the reporting around Drake's own residence and the incident involving a security guard being shot outside Drake's Toronto mansion during the height of the beef in 2024, a moment the fan base has tried very hard to reframe, but which the culture has quietly kept in its long memory. The third piece of cultural evidence is the podcast circuit, and this is the one nobody wants to acknowledge honestly. Over the last 24 months, on nearly every major hip-hop podcast, in nearly every major rap-adjacent interview, when the beef comes up, the tone has shifted. Not into explicit disrespect for Drake. The industry does not operate that way. Nobody is going to torch a bridge that generational. The shift is into something almost worse, a kind of polite, distant, uncomfortable acknowledgement. That tone is the tone the industry uses when it has already decided the outcome and is just waiting for the cameras to catch up. You can hear it. You can feel it. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. The fourth piece of cultural evidence, and this one gets closest to the heart of the entire thing, is the fan base's narrative work. What you are watching right now in real time is Drake's most invested fans performing what psychologists call motivated reasoning at industrial scale. They are inventing entire alternative histories of the beef, insisting Kendrick took, and I quote directly from the commentary that has been circulating, the sucker way out. As if a rap battle where you drop the biggest record of the decade could ever be classified as sucker behavior. They're arguing Kendrick othered Drake by pointing out he is from Canada, and then in the same conversation these same commentators are calling the fans of the World Cup Black Canadians without registering the contradiction. Because when you are inside that headspace, the contradiction is invisible. The contradiction is a feature, not a bug. And that is precisely what makes this a cultural phenomenon and not a rap phenomenon. Now in fairness, and I want to be fair here because the counterargument deserves to be heard, some people say every artist has irrational fans and Kendrick's fan base has its own share of unhinged behavior. And that is true. That is genuinely true. Kendrick fans have absolutely had their own crash-out moments and their own overreach. But the difference, and this is the difference that matters, is that Kendrick's fan base overreach has been about defending art. Drake's fan base overreach has been about defending a man from a verdict the culture already delivered against him. Those two things are not equivalent problems. Now I need you to shift gears with me here, because we are done with the culture layer and we are stepping into a completely different room. Forget the beef. Forget the songs. Forget the fans in the streets throwing speakers and filming apology videos. Because underneath everything you have just watched, there is a business layer, an industry layer, a machinery layer, and if you do not understand that layer, you do not actually understand this story at all. Everything I have described up to this point is a symptom. What I am about to walk you through is the disease. And I want to break it down across 3 separate systemic angles because it is not one thing. It is 3 interconnected things, and they all lead to the same conclusion. Angle 1, the label positioning. Drake and Kendrick both had, through most of the last decade, relationships with the Universal Music Group ecosystem. Drake through Republic. Kendrick historically through Interscope's Aftermath and TD Structure. When Not Like Us blew up and became the biggest single of the year, UMG did what any label conglomerate would do. It promoted the record. It ran the record. It pushed the record into every corner of its distribution machine. And Drake, in a move that shocked most people who understand how this business actually works, sued his own label ecosystem over that promotion, alleging UMG had elevated a record making defamatory claims about him. That case, as we already covered, was dismissed in October 2025, and Drake filed an appeal that is still working its way through the system right now. But here is the part the fan base cannot process. When you sue the machine that made you, you do not get to walk back into that machine the same way afterward. The relationship is permanently altered. The promotional weight you used to receive quietly, automatically, as a matter of course, that weight moves somewhere else. That machinery does not forgive. That machinery does not forget. Angle 2, the streaming economy. Every serious analyst inside this industry knows streaming numbers are not neutral. They are shaped by algorithmic placement, editorial playlist decisions, cross-catalog recommendation weighting, and label-driven push campaigns. When you are in good standing with your label and the label's distribution partners are pushing your catalog, you receive placement you never had to request. When you are in litigation with that label, that placement quietly, slowly, invisibly shifts. Nobody announces it. Nobody sends out a press release saying, "We are deprioritizing Artist X's back catalog." It simply happens. And when you look at what has been happening to catalog-level Drake streams versus event-level Kendrick streams over the last 18 months, you can see the shape of that shift, if you know what you are looking at. This is what people miss when they say Drake still streams more per day. Of course Drake does. Drake has a bigger catalog. Drake has been dropping records twice a year for over a decade. Raw volume is not the metric. Placement quality is the metric. Editorial trust is the metric. And on those metrics, the picture is not the picture the fan base is being sold. Angle 3, and this is the deepest one, so stay locked in with me, the narrative infrastructure. What Kendrick understood, and what nobody in the surrounding conversation seems to fully grasp, is that a rap beef in 2024 is not fought inside the songs. The songs are the surface. The real war is fought inside the narrative infrastructure surrounding the songs, the podcasts, the reaction channels, the memes, the TikToks, the reels, the think pieces, the academic essays, the fan communities, the algorithm's memory of what people are searching for 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later. Kendrick did not just make better records. Kendrick engineered records that were structurally designed to embed themselves into that narrative infrastructure in ways that would keep replaying and resurfacing and relitigating themselves without Kendrick ever lifting another finger. Not Like Us is a public health event, not a song. Not Like Us is a piece of content that operates independently of its creator's ongoing effort. That is why 2 years later it is still doing damage. That is why 2 years later Drake's fans are still throwing speakers over it. Because Kendrick's record was not built to win a battle. Kendrick's record was built to become part of the operating system of hip-hop conversation. And once it entered the operating system, it did not need Kendrick anymore. It runs on its own. That is what you are witnessing when a fan crashes out in a public park in 2026 over a song from 2024. You are watching a piece of infrastructure execute its function on schedule, and nobody, not Drake, not the fan base, not the podcast circuit, not the lawsuit, not any amount of streaming volume, can shut it down. Because you cannot sue infrastructure. You cannot outstream infrastructure. You cannot argue infrastructure into going away. Infrastructure just is. And Kendrick built infrastructure. That is the industry-level story the entertainment story has been hiding. Now here is the truth bomb. Here is the thing that once you see it, you cannot pretend you did not see it. What Kendrick Lamar actually did, The thing that needs to be studied, the thing this entire video has been building toward, is that Kendrick weaponized the very psychological architecture of Drake's fan base against them. And I need to be extremely clear about what that means, because this is the kind of claim people will try to twist. I am not saying Kendrick brainwashed anyone. I am not saying Kendrick used mind control. What I am saying, and what the evidence over 2 full years now supports, is that Kendrick understood something about Drake's specific fan base that Drake himself either did not understand or refused to accept. That Drake's fan base was structurally built on parasocial identification. It was built on the idea that Drake is one of them. That Drake speaks for them. That when Drake wins, they win. And when Drake is attacked, they are attacked. That is not a normal fan base structure. Most fan bases love the music and respect the artist. Drake's fan base merged its identity with the artist, and once you merge your identity with an artist, any attack on that artist becomes an attack on your self-concept. That is why they cannot let it go. That is why they are still throwing speakers in the summer of 2026. That is why they are still filming apology videos that are not actually apologies. That is why they are still launching GoFundMe campaigns. Because in their internal experience, the beef never ended. In their internal experience, the beef is happening right now every time they open their phones, every time they hear the song play in a passing car, every time somebody in a group chat sends them a meme. And Kendrick, with surgical precision, built records that would keep triggering that internal experience for years. That is what, and I want to be careful with this word, allegedly, but that is what appears to be the deliberate design of what Kendrick did. Kendrick did not make songs to end a battle. Kendrick made songs to permanently rewire the emotional operating system of the opposition fan base. And it worked. It is still working. It will be working 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when a teenager in a grocery store in Ontario in 2035 puts on a Kendrick record and a middle-aged Drake fan has to leave the aisle because he cannot handle it. That is what needs to be studied actually means. It is not a metaphor. It is a description of what the culture is going to have to reckon with, because we have never seen a rap record function this way before, and we will never look at rap beefs the same way after this. Call this what it is. Call this post-verdict denial syndrome. Call this the May 15th freeze. Because that is what you are watching. A fan base whose internal clock froze on the day Kendrick delivered the verdict, and no amount of Iceman rollouts, no amount of academics monologues, no amount of GoFundMe campaigns is going to unfreeze that clock. Now let me give the loyalist camp one honest concession, because I am not here to pretend everything Drake has done in this stretch has been a disaster. Drake's latest era, whatever era he is currently branding it as, has produced music that is genuinely better than most of what Drake has released in the last several years. There are moments on that album that remind you why Drake became Drake in the first place. I am not going to sit here and lie to you and say the Lawsuit album is unlistenable, because it is not. It is a competent record. It is, in stretches, an interesting record. But here is the receipt that closes the door. Even the strongest Drake material of this era cannot break Drake out of the frame Kendrick placed him inside. Every stream of a new Drake record now arrives inside a listener's brain already pre-labeled by the 2-year-old verdict. Drake cannot outproduce that label. Drake cannot outfeature that label. Drake cannot outmarket that label. Because the label was not placed on Drake by a journalist or a critic or a rival. The label was placed on Drake by the culture itself, and the culture does not take labels off on request. This is what I mean when I say Drake is the runner-up who refuses to accept the podium. The podium is not the problem. The refusal is the problem. Every additional year Drake spends refusing to stand on the second step is another year the culture spends re-remembering why the first step was already claimed. And here is where the machinery becomes truly ugly, because I want to be specific about the people carrying water for Drake right now inside the media ecosystem. I want to name the pattern. Not just academics, though academics is the concierge of the collapse, running the same recycled rumor cycle every 90 days about Kendrick being cornered, panicked, scared, working on a diss album, running out of time. Fill in whichever verb is convenient this week. But it is not just academics. It is the entire second tier of hip-hop commentary that has quietly outsourced its opinions to whichever direction the loudest stream numbers point. It is the reply guy content farm apparatus that has turned every Drake talking point into a coordinated deployment. It is the podcasters who used to have taste and now have angles. It is the timeline janitors, the algorithm-fed reply guys, the front-facing camera generals who mistake volume for evidence. These are the voices Drake's silence is now being replaced by, and every time one of them opens a laptop, Drake's brand takes another quiet hit that no PR firm can measure until it is already too late. Now I want to bring in one more angle that almost nobody in this conversation is willing to touch, because it is uncomfortable, but it is real. Kendrick's silence during all of this has itself become a competitive weapon. Kendrick is not tweeting. Kendrick is not clapping back. Kendrick is not going on podcast runs to relitigate ancient events. Kendrick is not filing lawsuits. Kendrick is not filming apology videos. Kendrick is doing what Kendrick has done from day one, which is releasing exceptional music on Kendrick's own schedule, performing at the biggest stages in the world when it is time, and letting the work speak for itself. That is the discipline that made this whole thing possible. That is the discipline that made Not Like Us the piece of infrastructure it became. And that is the discipline that is going to keep Kendrick standing exactly where Kendrick is standing, at the top of this culture, for as long as Kendrick chooses to remain there. Because in a media environment where every artist is expected to be online, be reactive, be constantly generating content about their own life, the artist who refuses to participate in that expectation ends up looking like the only serious adult in the room. Every silence Kendrick keeps makes every noise Drake's camp generates sound louder and more desperate by contrast. That is not an accident. That is a doctrine. That is a system. That is a way of operating inside modern celebrity that Kendrick appears to be the only figure in mainstream hip-hop who is fully internalized. The contrast one-liner writes itself. One artist made a record that ended a conversation. The other artist filed a lawsuit trying to unmake the record. And 2 years later, Kendrick's record is still playing in every stadium on the continent, and Drake's lawsuit is still sitting in appeals. That is the whole story in a single sentence, if you want it packaged. When you walk back through every moment we just covered, the Toronto crash out, the Rogers Center standing ovation, the podcast circuit's polite distance, the fan base's motivated reasoning, the label litigation, the streaming shift, the narrative infrastructure, every one of those moments points to the same conclusion. The person who operated with discipline is the person still standing. The person who operated from reactivity is the person whose fan base has become the story instead of the person. That is not luck. That is not cosmic favor. That is not a sorcerer waving a wand. That is what happens when a serious artist plays a serious game against an artist who thought the game was still about who could get louder on a Sunday afternoon. And now let me tie this back to why any of this matters beyond hip-hop, because you might be watching this and thinking, all right, this is a fun story, but why are we treating it like it is a defining cultural moment of the decade? Here is why. Because what happened between Kendrick and Drake, and specifically what has happened between Kendrick and Drake's fan base, is the clearest case study we have ever received of how the modern entertainment ecosystem actually functions when it is stress-tested. Every media theorist, every fan culture scholar, every marketer who is paying attention right now is watching this exact situation to understand how loyalty, identity, algorithmic reinforcement, parasocial attachment, litigation strategy, label politics, and streaming economics all collide when a single record enters the operating system and refuses to be removed. This is the case study. This is not an entertainment story. This is a media theory story wearing an entertainment costume. And the reason it is going to be studied in classrooms for the next 20 years is because it is the first time we have watched every one of these variables move in real time in front of the entire world, with receipts, with timestamps, with visible fan behavior data, and with two artists whose entire careers are still ongoing so that we can watch how the aftershocks continue to reshape the terrain. Here is a comment prompt I want you to take seriously. Drop below and tell me, in your view, what is the single most damaging behavior a Drake fan has produced in the last 12 months? Not the funniest. Not the most viral. The most damaging to the Drake brand itself. Because I have my own answer, and I have my own ranking, and I am curious whether the audience clocks the same one I clocked. And while you're at it, tell me whether you think Kendrick's continued silence is intentional strategy or just personal preference, because those are two different diagnoses that lead to two very different long-term forecasts for where this culture is heading next. Before we close this out, let me get one more receipt on the table, because I know somebody in the comments is going to try to argue this, and I want to head it off. Somebody is going to say, look, Drake still sells out arenas, Drake still moves units, Drake is fine. And the response to that is not to argue Drake is not commercially viable. Of course Drake is commercially viable. Drake has been commercially viable since 2009. The question is not whether Drake can still sell tickets. The question is whether Drake can ever again occupy the specific cultural altitude Drake used to occupy before May 2024. And the honest answer to that, based on every piece of evidence we just walked through, is no. Drake can still be enormous. Drake can still be rich. Drake can still be a top-tier commercial force. What Drake cannot be, and what Drake will not be again, is the undisputed avatar of mainstream rap that Drake spent 15 years positioning himself to be. That specific position now belongs to somebody else. The receipts are already printed. And no lawsuit, no rebrand, no Iceman rollout, no coordinated media campaign is going to reprint them. So to wrap this whole thing up before I let you go and click that next video I am going to recommend at the end of this one. The story is not that Kendrick won a beef. That was settled 2 years ago. The story is that Kendrick built a piece of cultural infrastructure that has continued to run every single day since, with zero maintenance required from the artist, doing damage that compounds rather than diminishes over time. The story is that Drake, instead of accepting that outcome and pivoting, chose to sue his own machine and, in doing so, permanently altered his own relationship with the very apparatus that used to elevate him. The story is that Drake's fan base, instead of processing the verdict and moving on, chose to freeze in place and become the ongoing punchline of the entire event. And the story is that Kendrick, through the deployment of a discipline the culture is still trying to understand, has managed to remain the loudest voice in the room without ever raising his voice. That is the whole thing. That is what everybody keeps missing when they treat this as a rap story. It stopped being a rap story 2 years ago. It is now a media theory story, an identity story, an infrastructure story, a case study in how modern celebrity actually works when it is stress-tested by a single decisive act. If you made it to the end of this video, do me a favor and hit the like button, subscribe if you have not already, and drop me a comment telling me which of the 4 evidence layers we walked through today, the visible, the cultural, the industrial, or the psychological, hit the hardest for you. Because I have seen the comments over the last few months on this channel, and I can tell you the answer is not what most creators would predict. Then, once you have done that, go watch the next video I am about to drop into your feed, because I am pulling together the full receipts on a completely different angle of this same story, and if you thought what we just walked through was damaging, wait until you see what happens when we get into the numbers that Drake's team has spent the last 12 months trying to keep out of the conversation entirely. I appreciate every one of you for staying locked in. Kendrick built the infrastructure. The culture is living inside it. And the receipts are already printed. See you in the next one. And one final thing before you close this tab, because I want to plant a seed for the next video, and I want to plant it deliberately. Watch what happens over the next 90 days. Watch the release cycle. Watch which podcasts get the exclusive first listen. Watch which streaming platforms build the front page campaigns. Watch which magazines land the cover story. Because those placements are not random. Those placements are the industry telling you, without ever saying it out loud, which artist the machinery is currently prioritizing. And when you watch Kendrick's next rollout arrive on schedule, with editorial partners lined up, with Grammy campaigns pre-briefed, with cultural institutions ready to receive it, and you compare that to whatever noise the Drake camp generates in the same window, you will see the shape of what I've been describing for the last 20 minutes in real time, right in front of your own eyes. That is the last receipt I am dropping on this table. The next 90 days are the confirmation window. Bookmark this video, come back to it in October, and tell me whether the pattern held. Because I already know it will. And once you see it hold, you will understand that this was never about Kendrick versus Drake. This was about the difference between an artist who builds infrastructure and an artist who builds noise, and about a culture that has already decided which of those two it wants to keep watching for the next decade. Kendrick built the infrastructure. Drake is still trying to argue with it. The receipts are already printed. And every 90 days from here, the receipts get harder to argue with. See you in the next one, for real this time.